Hello everyone, I'm Tommy from Tommy's Reptiles. I'm just sick and tired of always spending money on springtails and isopods and decided it's time for me to set up a culture of my own. So in this video, I'm going to show you an easy and cheap way to set up springtails and isopods. I picked up this clear plastic jar at Hobby Lobby. Originally, it was $3.49, but I believe it was 40% off. This jar is the perfect size for a starter culture of isopods and springtails. Isopods and springtails are the perfect cleanup crew for any bioactive setup. They keep your enclosure very clean and also eat the waste of your reptiles and amphibians. Let's drill some air holes. First, I'm drilling a line of air holes into where I want the top of the enclosure to be. Since this is a plastic material, you don't want to push the drill down too hard. You want to let the drill do the work so you don't crack the plastic. You want to make enough holes where the inhabitants can get enough oxygen, but too much moisture can't leak out. That's a pretty straight road just for eyeballing it. Next, we're going to drill one more air hole right on this side of the jar. This will give the inhabitants optimum airflow. For the stand of this mini enclosure, I also picked up these wooden blocks at Hobby Lobby. They were also very cheap. To give the isopods and springtails optimal space, I decided to make this a horizontal enclosure. So now I'm just trying to figure out the perfect placement of these wooden blocks. I'll be using Gorilla Glue to secure the jar to the wooden blocks. I'm adding a good amount of glue to each block. It's better to have more and not need it than to need more and not have it. I decided that I wanted the corners of the blocks to touch because I think it looks better, and I also think it'll make the jar more secure. Now for the moment of truth. Let's place the jar onto the wooden blocks. Here, I just want to make sure that the jar is perfectly centered over the blocks, and then I want to hold it in place for a little while until I can let it go. After pressing the jar to the wooden blocks, you really only have about a minute or two to make minor adjustments until you have to leave it alone and let it dry. That's pretty good. I think I almost got it perfectly centered. And while we're waiting for it to dry, we might as well just start scaping it. For the substrate, I'm just using some leftover Dart Frog bioactive substrate that I had left over. And I'll also be adding a little extra carbon. Then I'm just simply covering the top of the cup with a little bit of tin foil to make it easier to shake without getting substrate all over the floor. Once it was all nice and mixed up, I sprayed it down with a little water. It's very important to maintain moisture in an isopod and springtail enclosure so it doesn't dry out. I mixed it up one more time to make sure everything got a little damp, and this is how it turned out. Now it's time to take the lid off this jar and start scaping. I had to be careful taking off the lid though, so it didn't mess up the glue. To insert the substrate into the jar, I simply just used a plastic spoon. I made sure to be very careful when putting this substrate inside the jar so it would not move at all. I also wanted to make sure that I put in enough substrate where the isopods and springtails can burrow down into it. Then I started inserting little pieces of cork bark into the jar so the isopods and springtails can have some refuge. I'm hoping that in a few months I can pick up one of these pieces of cork bark and it will be completely covered with isopods and springtails. I feel like cork bark is a must for mini enclosures because it looks great and you could break it into small pieces. Now I'm inserting a little bit of frog moss to give it a little touch of life and some greenery. This frog moss will also help maintain this mini ecosystem. Next up, I'll be inserting some leaf litter. These oak leaves will not only provide cover for the inhabitants, but they'll also provide a nice little snack. I also think that these little leaves make this enclosure look absolutely stunning. Now we're gonna add a little bit of damp sphagnum moss to the enclosure to make sure it maintains moisture. This way the isopods, springtails, and moss have something to drink. This enclosure will house white dwarf isopods and pink springtails. Here's a close-up of some of the dwarf white isopods. Let's put them in the jar. I like to use a spoon because it's easy to slide them right off into the enclosure without harming them. And great news, it looks like they already had babies. Let's put the rest of the isopods in and then get on to the springtails. Here's a good close-up of the springtails. They may be hard to see, but they are those little specks moving around in the dirt. Let's start placing them into their new home. Once this colony is established, I'm going to take out some of the inhabitants and start a few more jars. Now let's cap this bad boy up and get a closer look. I really like how this mini jar enclosure turned out. This enclosure was very affordable It was fun to set up, and it was super easy. Anyone could set this up in just a couple minutes. Now let's finalize it by slapping a Tommy's Reptile sticker right on the lid. Perfect fit! I think that creating these little habitats are a great way to add a little accent into your reptile room. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching Tommy's Reptiles.